Hello, everybody. I want to begin by thanking Professor Douglas Jones and the team at ITU Copenhagen for the invitation to join you in this course and to deliver this keynote on interruption, which I have conceptualized as a series. I'm thinking about it as interruption, pause, reorientation. But before we get into the thoughts that I want to share with you, I wanted to begin by reminding us that I am recording this. It's actually June 6th, 2020, and we are in the middle of a global pandemic, but also in the middle of widespread protests against racism, systematic racism, against police brutality in the United States, and against the killing of Black people in this country that have been ignited by the recent events where police officers took the life of George Floyd. But I also want to recognize that the protests and the mobilization have been happening for a long time, have been led by many movements historically in this country, and those, of course, include the Black Lives Matter movement. So in the midst of all of these, we find ourselves with immediate responsibilities, both in personal terms, but also in terms of our research, trying to make sense of its significance, of its prospects. And so these questions about the significance of our research take a different meaning depending on our own structural positions in society. And what I want to gesture at here is that the way that my research as a professor is interrupted differs from the way in which the research of a student or the research of a postdoc or of a precarious academic is interrupted. So the thoughts I want to offer today, I would invite to consider them always interrogating how this might or might not speak to people that are occupying different spaces in the academic system. So in the coming days, you're going to encounter fantastic materials to give you ideas about specific ways in which you can adjust or adopt new methods in your research process. So you're going to learn about habits, skills, and practices that you can draw on for these purposes. So what I thought I would do today is something a little bit different. I want to share with you some of my reflections on what interruption means, what pausing means, what reorientation might mean in this particular moment, and also to do so in a collective manner. So I'm going to begin the first part, offering you these reflections, and then on the second part, we're going to have three of my students here at the anthropology department at Rice University join us, and they are also going to share their thoughts and their experiences. These are students that are at different levels in the program. One of them, Yesmar Oyarzun, is what we call pre-fieldwork, at a pre-fieldwork stage, and two of them, Katie Ulrich and Mel Ford, were actually conducting fieldwork internationally when the pandemic hit. So to begin us with our first section of the conversation, I want to return to the keywords or the terms that I've used to organize it. And I want to think about interruption as pause and as reorientation. And in each of these forms, we can ask ourselves, what is at stake for our project, for our research, both in terms of a series of techniques or practices for reflection, but also in terms of the political stakes of our project, the political stakes of the knowledge that we want to produce. And here, what I'm referring to is something that we can think of as the significance and the ethical import of our projects, or the things that we're doing, not in and of themselves as abstract issues, but think about the relationship between those concerns, the politics and the ethics of our projects, uh, and the actual research practices that we are taking. And it's the connection between those two things, the ethics and the politics of our projects, the research questions, and actually a third one, the methods that we utilize to address the encounter of those two, that I want to organize my comments. So let's think with pause. Let's begin with the idea of pause, interruption as pause. In our academic settings, one of the first things that happened when the pandemic hit was that it enacted a pause. We were told by our respective institutions and by healthcare officials to pause activities, to halt activities. So a pause ensued, a kind of suspension that had probably unexpected effects. Beyond the personal and the emotional toll that this pause forced on us, also it posed questions about our work. From my point of view, one of the first questions that quickly emerged was in relation to time. The pandemic made explicit, and hence it denaturalized, the temporality of our work. This pause introduced questions, or it challenged the temporality that we had probably presumed was organizing our work. It forced us to stop. And that pause had the effect of revealing many assumptions that we were operating on. One of them, or one way to think about those assumptions, are the idea that research activities are something akin to a river, flowing endlessly, always with a current, moving constantly. So this creates somewhat of a forward-looking temporality of your project that is produced cyclically by things like going to class, adding one more interview to one scheduled, increasing the number of meetings attended, and so on and so forth. And we also expect these things to happen at a particular rhythm. So going to class on a weekly basis, setting preliminary interviews in the next 10 days, finishing your grant proposal by the month of May because of a deadline. The pandemic put a temporary hold on that. And that pause in our labor weakened and questioned the connections between time, between the administrative checkpoints that organize our labor practices as workers of the university, as people that whose labor is dedicated to doing research, and it also created a disjuncture in terms of the outcomes expected out of this labor. But it also revealed a tendency among many of us that before the pandemic, we embodied this idea of structuring our daily activities around efficient means-ends relations. And these means-ends relations privileged the instrumental character of our daily work. But with coronavirus, seemingly those relations stopped, and that instrumental relation broke. I find it interesting that such breaking of our professional temporality and the associated debilitation of instrumental relations are not unique to the pandemic condition, and yet we reacted as if they were. Those of us who conduct fieldwork are used to moments when there is no constant flow of events. If anything, fieldwork is made up of accelerations of time, periods that seem to be filled with activity, and decelerations of time, periods when all we do, it seems, is keep our bodies and our institutions alive, rather than accomplishing interviews or acquiring transformative insights. So what I want to suggest is that something that this pause that the pandemic introduced do was to put us in the midst of the kinds of experiences that we have when we conduct fieldwork. Even if we first thought that the pandemic was like a switch that turned off our research lives, it was far from that. Instead, it brought into our daily lives the conditions that we tend to experience while doing fieldwork. In other words, what the pause did is remind us what we already know from fieldwork experiences, that our research lives are always determined by intensities, different degrees of activity, full of times when things seem to be suspended. And yet, in those times, you're still in what we call the fieldwork modality. So, this breaking of means ends relations can be quite painful. It has material consequences that are asymmetrically experienced. For many of you, it creates challenges in terms of funding, for instance, uncertainties in terms of job prospects. So I really do not want to romanticize the pandemic pause in any kind of way. But all I want to acknowledge is that the pandemic makes explicit a certain underlying assumption about how the world works, always in flux, always as a sequence of instrumental actions. And so it makes us reconsider what fieldwork as a moment in the research process does to our methodologies and to our subjectivities. The pause the pandemic imposes lays bare those ontological assumptions. So it's almost like it brings the conditions of the field worker or the field researcher, particularly for those that are doing ethnography, and replicates those in a moment when those conditions are not supposed to be the organizing conditions of our lives. So in another way, it challenges the separation between what it means to be at the university and what it means to be doing research in a particular social setting. So in relation to this last point, another thing the pandemic pause does is to suspend the myth of the researcher controlling the design and unfolding of their project. And this is a myth that all field workers have seen debunked in their practice. Nevertheless, it continues to be used as a model for preparation and as a model for training as you go into your research projects. So in a way, we could say that the pause the pandemic introduced can operate as a crash course, also as a traumatic experience, through which that uncertainty has invaded your professional work before you find yourself at the moment of conducting the research in terms of what is called data collection. So what happens after that pause, that original or initial pause? What I want to suggest is that what follows can be thought of as a moment of reorientation. So we reorient ourselves, re-immerse in our projects, and try to regain our momentum, not to replicate what was happening before in terms of its specificities, of where we were, with whom were we talking, but in terms of the momentum and the drive of the research process. So how does that reorientation play about? How is it organized? There's at least two ways to think about it, and these are not exclusive. These two ways can work in tandem. So one way is that which invites you to use methods that will allow you to approximate the things that were going to happen had the pandemic not hit. So trying to be in the same places, connecting with the same people through alternative means. And at least for the particular moment that many of us are in, which is a moment of confinement, this means an intense use of the internet as a form of communication. So you conduct interviews over the internet, you try to organize maybe focus groups, you do online surveys, you make a really good effort to delve into social networks or social platforms. So that's one avenue. Another avenue is to what I imagine or what I think of as rethinking what methods look like and what dominant forms of engagement you want to use and which you want to stay away from. So instead of trying to be there through the internet as you had been or as you would have been if you were able to conduct your fieldwork, you can imagine other things that you can do as you reorient your project and your research design. So let me give you two possibilities for what that reorientation might look, with the idea that these might become avenues that themselves are going to change as the conditions of confinement and as the situation with the pandemic changes. Let's think about it in a thematic kind of way to begin with. The pandemic brings into sharp relief the systemic inequalities and systemic racism that undergirds all of our societies in Denmark, in the United States, or in Brazil. So that is always tricky to chart relation between a level that we could call the aggregate level or the systemic level and the specificities of the contexts that we do research in, the specific people that we speak to, the specific offices, sites, homes, towns where we locate ourselves. There's one way to take cues from this particular moment in history is to make explicit the ways in which we can think about the systemic while remaining committed to, in my case, ethnographic fieldwork, to the specificities of the situated people and the practices we want to study. In my own research, I have done this by focusing on something that I've called techno-legal devices, instruments that people use to shape systemic logics, but which can be traced to specific offices, homes, desks, and daily tasks. Thus, instead of thinking that a project is determined by being in a particular place, you can adjust your design to think about the devices through which those worlds are brought into being in connection to aggregate or systemic issues. And you can design fieldwork that occurs in person, but also fieldwork that happens in the realm of the history of ideas, in the realm of the basic assumptions that technical fields make, in the realm of the organizing principles of religious institutions, etc. It depends on what your project is. So thinking about the fieldwork and thinking about data collection as both something that entails interpersonal interactions, but also as something that can happen in diverse settings, such as the history of ideas, to say something. So thematically, you would ask, what does it mean to connect systemic questions that we find in the history of ideas to the specific people, specific sites that I had originally imagined as the sites where I would be conducting research. This attempt to connect these different domains would lead you into different scales and also into different times in history. And so in a way, that is something that we can remain open to in this particular moment. Now, what would fieldwork look like if it asked about systemic logics? What forms of worldly evidence would you gather? What kind of data, to use another word, would need to be created to speak to these issues? So this kind of reorientation creates an opportunity to think very creatively about the data that we want to produce, rather than just presuming that co-presence, spending time with another person, will automatically yield insights. So, in other words, what the pandemic condition asks us to think about is the way in which we have presumed that co-presence is a window into understanding another person's life or another group's life. And think about what other ways you can associate or you can articulate or design to complement the possibility of co-presence. I wouldn't say to replace. I don't think it's replaceable, but you can generate alternate companion forms of conducting fieldwork. And I will say that STS and anthropology are full of resources to keep this dual sensibility alive, the sensibility to the specific conditions in which people live their lives and the more aggregate systemic questions. So what I want to suggest is that this is a moment when the extractivist logics that have undergirded so much research come into question. If normally you would think that your role is to collect information from your interlocutors about how they go about their lives, the pandemic requires a more generative and reciprocal or relational conceptualization. This shift is possible as we return to maybe even a more classic ethnographic methodology that is less focused on interviewing and conversation and puts more emphasis on things like participant observation. And what I'm going to say might sound a little bit counterintuitive. I believe that the pandemic opens an opportunity to do more participant observation rather than less. So let me explain what that means. In participant observation under conditions of pandemic, we can open the door for much more reciprocal relations. So what are the concerns that people have in pandemic conditions? We could ask ourselves, and this, of course, in connection to the specific themes that you are researching. What are the difficulties that they are encountering in their work, in finding work, in daily banking needs, in filing unemployment claims, in keeping their products in the market, in using online technologies? So what if instead of presuming that ethnographic fieldwork is about asking them how they are dealing with those issues, what if instead of doing that, fieldwork returned to a more classic form of participant observation through maybe unconventional means? So I want to make clear, I'm not suggesting that what our research is going to turn is into activities that are designed to help people. Many of the interlocutors that we have do not need our help. And it would be presumptuous to assume that our role is to help them. However, what I want to think about is what if, as researchers, we took it on ourselves to figure out what are the tasks, the new tasks that are occupying people, the new problems that are emerging in this new context, and to share some of that difficulty, and even to share sometimes even the dull and boring acts that people have to undertake to keep their work, their ideas, and their daily routines going. So to figure out what we might have to offer, how can our skills be mobilized to accomplish some of these daily actions? And this reorientation can remind us that the world was never paused, that the intensity and shape of people's actions changed, but life was never put on hold, nor was your own creativity and curiosity as researchers. So in this new form of participant observation, where we take on joint problems, rather than presuming that participant observation entails being there and witnessing other people go through these things, might open really interesting possibilities and horizons for participant observation as a classic ethnographic form of knowledge production. So I'm now going to pass it on to Yesmar, Katie, and Mel, who will give you very concrete examples of how they have paused and reoriented their research in our current conditions. After the presentation, we'll have time for conversation, and we look forward very much to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Yesmar Oyarzun and I'll be presenting Access Denied, Reimagining Access Post-COVID-19. So first, a little bit about me. I'm a second year graduate student at Rice University and I am in the Department of Anthropology. What that means is I'm in the piloting phase of my research, which is on dermatology and the use of the category of skin of color in dermatological practices. And so what my research involves is, in the future, following dermatologists around in their day-to-day practices and learning what they do and why they do it, as well as interviewing them to sort of figure out those same things and conducting focus groups to see how groups of dermatologists react to the use of skin of color and agree or disagree. So a little bit of a timeline. Since December, I had been planning to go to a conference that would start on March 17th of 2020 that would host pretty much all of the dermatologists with whom I'm interested in the same room at the same time, which is a really great way to gain access to my interlocutors. I had finished the IRB process in February, and in early March, I went to another conference, an anthropology conference, where I met a whole bunch of anthropologists who I'd never met for the first time, where I handed out business cards, where I shook hands with people and ate dinner with anthropologists I'd never met before. And so by the time I got back from that conference, it was inconceivable that I would be doing any conferencing anytime soon. But the dermatology conference was still offered through a platform that looked like this, and it's a really genius platform. It's a poster gallery. There's a video gallery where you can go and see the poster and lecture presentations from the conference. However, that conference's proximity to the anthropology conference made me realize how much really access is a two-way street, how much we take for granted the ways that our interlocutors get access to us through face-to-face interactions and other means. And so my new research design looks like this. It's snowball sampling, which is very common in social science research, but I realized that the use of initial participants who are already new, contacts that I had met through previous research or through people this year who have introduced me to dermatologists, have really allowed me to access and sort of provide that credibility that I could provide in face-to-face interaction through them. And so there's a sort of trickle-down credibility that comes from the top, where my initial participants who know me can assure my primary referrals that I am a person to be trusted, that I am a person that does research, that I am a person affiliated with a certain institution, and it really allows me to not do the other form of sampling that you see on the right, which is doing cold contacts, which is, in my experience, a lot harder to gain access and a lot harder to establish credibility, especially through the methods that we're using now, which are Zoom and telephone and email. And a lot of the first responses that I get are through email and telephone. So the question that I want to end on is, how can we use technologies to continue to facilitate access that goes both ways, that ensures both connection and ways of establishing credibility? And is technology enough to, like email, like phone, to continue to form those bonds and establish that credibility? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Katie Ulrich. I'm a PhD student in the anthropology department at Rice University. And my research is on sugarcane bioproducts like bioplastics, biofuels, biocosmetics, biopharmaceuticals being produced in Brazil. So I'm working with Brazilian scientists researching sugarcane as a biomass. I'm working with sugar industry people in Brazil to see how, in different ways, they're working to make sugarcane a plant for these new imaginaries of environmental futures. So I was in the middle of fieldwork in Sao Paulo when the pandemic hit. And so I came back, I left the field in March and came back to Houston. So interruption has been something I've been experiencing and thinking about a lot lately. And so right now, I'd like to think about two moments in particular from my research in the past few weeks that I think are interesting for thinking about what interruption means for us right now. So the first moment is the fact that my research was interrupted directly because my interlocutors themselves had their research interrupted. So at the time in March, I was doing day-to-day participant observation in the lab, and the whole university suspended its activities due to the pandemic a few weeks before I left. So my interlocutors, who are researchers themselves, also found their work interrupted. And what struck me as I was talking to not only them, but also other friends I have who work in labs in the US as well, was all the work that was required to interrupt their research in the lab. So a nice artifact I kind of drew out from this are all these lab ramp down checklists. So all these things that people needed to do to effectively shut down the lab for an unknown period of time. These included, throwing out things that would go bad, adjusting, temperatures and whatnot on ovens or fridges, making sure there was someone who could come in to refill liquid nitrogen that hooked up to a cryogenic tank, for example. So I was struck by all the work it took to not be productive, to not do work. So this, for me, makes me think about how interruption can itself become an object of analysis, an object of study, not just something we experience, but something our interlocutors are experiencing too. In this way, it helps show different dimensions of social life, and so it helps us study the things we were studying before in different registers. And this relates to the second moment I want to talk about, which is also to this idea of different registers of thinking about things we were thinking about before. So the second moment was a few weeks ago during one of the virtual lab meetings I attended. So the lab I had been doing participant observation, and they continued to have these virtual lab meetings. And a few weeks ago, explicitly came up how these lab meetings are different now, and not just because, of course, they're virtual, but they're talking about how the nature of their conversations were changed too. So for example, normally people would report on, data, what they were recently working on in the lab. But now a lot of people don't have fresh data since they can't go into the lab. So instead they're kind of polling on or talking about these troubleshooting issues. So these minor technical issues, it's a lot of, for example, a growth curve that has like a weird peak at one point. And so they'll present that. And then the discussion of the lab meeting centers around, well, what's going on with this weird peak? And so it's about troubleshooting. They get to be these very philosophical conversations about, what data is true or what's real or what's the best, measurement for something. And so they've been really interesting. And, and this is something that STS scholars have talked about a lot, these kind of tacit understandings or background things that happen in the production of scientific knowledge. But to have it so explicitly on display in a lab meeting and have them acknowledge that this is not something that they would normally focus on in a lab meeting, but they acknowledged it was a very important discussion, and even said they wanted to continue to have these kinds of discussions even after the pandemic is over. So it was helpful for me in terms of thinking about it as, in parallel with my own research. So thinking about not completely changing the object of my research. I'm not going to go start researching the pandemic or the virus now, but thinking about different ways I can attune to my research, see different dimensions that always existed before, but now the pandemic is shedding light on them a different way, or forcing me to attune to them in a different way. In the same way, these scientists are now attuning in different ways to their own practices. So just as a quick summary, the things I've been thinking about are interruption as its own kind of object of analysis, and then related to that as something that helps us, that doesn't change our object of study, but changes the way we attune to those objects we were already thinking about.
Hi, my name is Mel. I am a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at Rice University. I am currently residing in Guatemala City, where I am conducting long-term fieldwork with independent architects, municipal urban planners, and city residents as they navigate urban conservation designs for Guatemala City. Specifically, I am interested in ravines, which are these Here, there are these giant tropical canyons that are notorious for clandestine landfills and landslides and informal settlements, and are generally just really difficult spaces to incorporate into city planning. However, they do make up 42% of Guatemala City's territory, so they have this large presence in the city and are what many in the city are calling the city's last natural green areas. So I asked questions about how architects and urban planners and city residents figure these ravines differently into their daily work and social life. While much of my original research plan involved participant observation, COVID-19 has obviously forced me to reconsider some of these research methods and questions. And for a while this was a little difficult because so much of anthropology is advertised as a being there, as a seeing, touching of the senses type of research. And this left me at first, like many, with uncertainty about finishing and going about conducting social face-to-face work. But then I realized that this time could be utilized for building a different type of relationship with my data, my interlocutors, and my field site. So what does this look like? Because many of the people that I work with are considered experts, they publish not only theses, but articles, opinion pieces, research reports, and in these reports, there's a lot of textual information that sits silently in the background of their decisions and actions. And so for the most part, up until this moment, I had taken these materials as secondary sources, which is to say as ways of informing myself of the scientific, historical, and cultural relationship or background of architecture and the environment here in Guatemala City. However, during this time, I am taking these materials and I am purposefully turning them into primary sources, which is to say that I am not taking their information for granted. And so part of this transition is recognizing that much of this material is packed with particular decisions and are written for specific types of audiences. Much of this work is not published in academic journals at all, for example. It is instead published through institutional websites, NGOs, nonprofit research centers that don't have an academic affiliation at all. So for example, this movement of ecological architecture here in Guatemala City started with a research report that was sponsored by the city municipality, as well as a couple of independent architects who were interested in jumpstarting this movement around ecological design and the incorporation of ravines into the overall city plan. And this architectural report reads like anything but an architectural blueprint for urban design initiatives. Instead, it is packed with statistics about property and land ownership and poverty and a historical review of urbanization and even a review of colonization of the area. And while this information is useful, I found it originally to be a little bit frustrating because I was extremely interested in analyzing specific architectural models and installations that would take place within the city. But then as I combed through these reports, I realized that many of the architects and the authors of this work, they themselves are the researchers of the movement that they are building, both physically and metaphorically. So whereas originally I read this report as background knowledge and information and took these statistics for granted and regarded them as truth, I am now asking questions like, where did this information come from, and what were the questions and gaps in their knowledge that led to the necessity to find, build, research, demand this type of information. So for example, if we go back to the statistic of 42% of Guatemala City are ravines, the statistic came from this report that was sponsored by the municipality. And I had an interesting conversation with an architect who told me to question the statistic. And this led me to ask, what defines a ravine and where are a ravine's physical limits? Why was the statistic necessary to begin with? And when I began to take this source and ask the architects who wrote this report these types of questions, they began to unpack boxes of knowledge and assumptions and decisions that led to the production of this report. And through these conversations just about research reports, just about the information that is contained in this digitally accessible file, I am learning so much more about the context and politics behind urban planning in Guatemala City that I could never observe. So I guess this purposeful movement between secondary and primary sources really challenges not only my own assumptions of how the city works, feels, and looks like, but also those of the authors, directors, and designers of the city themselves. And doing this has allowed me to get a different and extremely important insight into the context of which I work and the context that my interlocutors work in.